cohesion, and with the commitment to empower migrants and societies to realize full inclusion and social cohesion. And this webinar series is organized by the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, the International Institute for Migration and Development, Metropolis Asia Pacific, as well as the Migrant Forum in Asia. And I will be your moderator for today. My name is Paddy Sianga Knudsen, and I'm the Vice President for GRFDT, one of the organizers for this webinar series. And as we have mentioned several times, the webinar series is attached to a certificate program on the Global Compact for Migration. So we take time to dive into the Compact objectives, as well as to talk about migration theory, and also many other issues that bring the different connections between the GCM objectives. So as every Tuesday and Thursday, since for February and March, we are delighted to dive into these issues. And for today, GCM 16 reminds us of the commitment, which reads as follows. We commit to foster inclusive and cohesive societies by empowering migrants to become active members of society and promoting the reciprocal engagement of receiving communities and migrants in the exercise of their rights and obligations towards each other, including observance of national laws and respect for customs of country of destination. We further commit to strengthen the welfare of all members of society by minimizing disparities, avoiding polarization, and increasing public confidence in policies and institutions related to migration, in line with the acknowledgement that fully integrated migrants are better positioned to contribute to prosperity. A lot of big words and a lot of words that have a lot of responsibility across different levels of government, but also a lot of roles that have to be played by other members in society, all the way from private sector to the agency that migrants have. We have in the last couple of weeks touched on 15 of those, and from time to time we touch on inclusion, and we touch on issues that are related to social cohesion. But today we try to unpack these, and we are really glad that we have a full panel with us today. We've got Dr. Kennedy Achakomo, who is a labor economist and with the African Trade Union Migration Network, and he's with the Trade Union Congress in Ghana. So we'll be hearing a lot of his experience, not just from the ECOWAS region, but also from the extensive experience that he has on the continent. We'll be hearing from Marco Ricorda, who is the communication manager for the Mediterranean City-to-City Migration Project under ICMPD. And we are glad that ICMPD is not on the picture today, but has been with us and provided a lot of inputs to some of the lectures and webinar series, even in the previous cohort. And also we're delighted to be joined by Sharmaka Dubois, who is a councillor from the City of Victoria in Canada. And to our panelists, we want to say thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. And as we dive into it, I wonder if I could, already, I know that, often students are asking us, why don't we go through all the text of the commitment, because we should draw on particular actions which are outlined in the GCM. And what's always important for us in this forum is to really see what's happening at that local space, what inspires from the global space participation or action at the local side, or is there indeed, as we have seen in other spaces, a disconnect between what we aspire on the global space and what is actually happening on the ground. And with this panel today, we'll be able to dive into different actions that we'll hear from the different localities where our panelists are based. We have Canada, we have Marco, who looks particularly at the Mediterranean space, and also Kennedy, who will be talking to us about the experience from Africa. And we know that many different experiences will come on from the Americas, from Asia, from the Pacific, and from, even localities as well, because we know that our participants are really active and engaging with us. So we're hoping that we can also hear from you. But let's kick off and ask, maybe we put Marco on the spot as, being a communication manager. Marco, I think it's a good position for us to start off with you. But as I introduce Marco before giving him his questions, Marco Ricorda is the communication, he's a communication expert and an analyst and a commentator in the field of international organizations. He works around diplomacy and cooperation as well. And he has served as the communication manager for the MC2C, or rather city to city initiative, a project that brings together city leaders, civil servants, local, national, and international experts from multiple disciplines to improve migration governance at the urban level. Now, Marco, our question, we know the importance that cities play in terms for migrants, as migrants are leaving their various, it could be transit homes, or it could also be, the countries of origin. The target is usually trying to see where they can improve their livelihoods. So we wanted to hear, with the scope of work that you're doing on this particular project, but also in other areas with ICMPD, please just tell us a bit more about what you sort of see as the position of livelihood opportunities for everyone in the city. We're also quite keen to hear about, this engagement of the private sector, and what does inclusion mean and in that particular space, and what does that do for migrants, and indeed, where does inclusion start from? So Marco, please feel free to take the floor.
Thank you, Patty, very much. Thank you, GRFDT, for this opportunity. And thank you to all the students that are connecting from all over the world and from different time zones. It's very important, in my opinion, to analyze this type of documents, of declarations one by one, as you're doing in your course, because it creates a certain structure that will avoid being over generic on certain issues. And I think that tackling the issue of social inclusion by looking exactly at what the declaration says is the right way to go to learn something and then to apply it in whatever governance context you will find yourself. In this case, what I'm going to bring today, some experience from ICMPD as an overall organization, but in particular when it comes to the role of cities, the relationship also of cities with other levels of governance, of course, regional governments, national governments, international frameworks, and so on. And I will highlight, of course, a number of challenges and opportunities that we live every day. And of course, the last 2 years have taught us even more, because there has been a sort of change of the conception of cities to make them more sustainable, to make them more livable, and of course also to create inclusion for all, not only for migrants but for all, because especially I'm going to introduce now the role of the private sector engagement within the integration of migrants and social inclusion. A lot of jobs have been lost over the past 2 years. Therefore, we are also in an era where the job market will change significantly when it comes especially to services. Therefore, how does this affect migrants integration and migrants inclusion? I particularly care about this topic, and another topic, which is, you mentioned it yourself, Patty, right? It's part of the text, it is avoid polarization. When it comes to avoiding polarization, the role of communicators, of campaigners, of even speakers that are able to communicate a straight message in the right forum, or even at somebody in a very informal manner, is fundamental to then facilitate social inclusion, because a lot of the polarization that we see today, especially in the area of my competence, which is the Mediterranean area, is very strong because of a very strong polarization where people do not talk to each other about certain topics related to migration. When speaking about migration and the private sector, we usually think of matters that pertain to, let's say, only employment or financial support. However, I like to think about partnerships. Private and public partnerships in the field of migration do represent, in my opinion, really the potential to fill the gap at any stage of the migration and, following the GCM declaration, integration process. Integrated is a word that you see very often in the declaration. I think we can debate about that also when it comes to the language, but I think we know what we're talking about. So there is the migration, then there is the integration process to make sure that a new person is part of the city, of the society fully, and is part of the overall process of society, which is continuous, especially in moments of critical pressure on public infrastructure and services. What we've had over the past 2 years has been a total disaster for many sectors. Therefore, making sure that no one is left behind when infrastructure at the global level, I have to say, of course, when we look at Europe, maybe certain services are more advanced than other part of the world, But if we look at a global scale, the pressure that the medical system, for instance, has undergone is a big problem also for integration, in my opinion. So businesses and the attractiveness of cities as business hubs do contribute with their existing infrastructures and establish partnerships with companies that create jobs and relationships, as well as the expertise to support migration governance. What do I mean by that? When cities are vibrant and they are attractive business destinations and attractive people destinations, they also gather an incredible amount of knowledge. And when there is a right exchange between this amount of knowledge that is provided mostly by the private sector with the public sector, when there is a forum for exchange, integration works better because these opportunities are available to everyone. So private sector partners can also propose innovative solutions to, let's say, to some of the challenges faced by national and international governments. Of course, I might be a little biased because the project I represent today, MC2CN, is a project that aims at giving a stronger voice to cities in migration governance. I might be a little biased because of the hat I'm wearing today, but I do believe that matters because cities are indeed the first receivers of migrants. They are the most attractive hubs. I would say for people in general today, there is still a strong interest in moving towards cities. We see still a movement of leaving rural areas to find better opportunities. With a small exception, just to be clear, of course, the pandemic and the lockdowns have slightly reversed this trend. I have to say that for the sake of accuracy. But if we look at the past 50 years, this trend is basically unequivocally going towards more urbanization. So it is in the interest of governments and international organizations to carefully consider the multifaceted role that the private sector plays in the different stages of the migration cycle. Supporting, first of all, migrant entrepreneurship can help cities. So that in my opinion, should be the first step, the first stone to lay down. And maybe then I will leave some space to the next speakers. Why do I want to stress on that to conclude? Because inclusion is easier when there are jobs that are up for grab. So if a city facilitates business, in the word of a very important Moroccan entrepreneur that took part in one of our events recently, and I will share a lot of this content in the chat and then to you, Paddy, to be distributed. A very important Moroccan entrepreneur told us, when we look at cities, we don't look at nationalities, we look at competence. Therefore, I think that's where we should start, gathering competence in order to facilitate inclusion. That is one of the main key findings we have found in our years of work at MC2CN, but it's of course one of the bigger tenets that as ICMPD we are promoting and will keep promoting over the next few years.
Marco, thank you for that response. I'm just wondering, maybe we do a comeback question to you, because we realize that indeed cities have taken much more prominence now, even on global governance stage in relation to migration. And before you sort of have, even for the negotiations, actually, I wonder, we could probably count on a few hands how many countries took representatives of their cities, for instance, to the GCM negotiations. And maybe we can count a few more when we look at those that engaged cities, local municipalities, also in the negotiations. And just ordinarily, even for those countries that even never signed on to the GCM or kind of, took this global initiative into as part of their national perspective on looking at migration, still the involvement of cities was less and less, and now there's been quite a prominence on it. But we also know that it has a lot to do with decentralization policy. It has a lot to do with how migration and development is sort of looked at on a national scale. And But then how do you then reconcile, just also thinking about your project as well, the fact that sometimes maybe at the national level, there may not be this need to sort of do something about migration governance. So where do cities find their legitimacy, to sort of, go into the area of supporting initiatives with migrants? Where do they, talk to us about some of the spaces where there is no kind of national legitimacy, if you want, to a very clear policy, but cities are stepping up and saying, regardless of what we have, what we don't have, we're going to move with the means that are available to us.
Well, that's a very good point and a very tough question, I must admit. Let's just say that it's very hard to identify a set of recommendations that work for all cities globally. We have first to understand the political system where these cities operate, the cooperation level, the ability they have also to raise their voice towards national governments, and then whether there are networks of cities, there are plenty today, that can then together make sure their voices are heard at the national, regional, international level. So therefore, I cannot provide a recommendation at the global level. But what I can do is to tell you what we found out in our region. So our region, what we call the Mediterranean region, is pretty much made of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. And of course, even in our short informal talk before this lesson, we could identify a number of similarities and differences. Let's say one thing, for instance, in Europe, it is very common to have what we call the political cohabitation, meaning that certain cities have a specific political color who might disagree with the government. Therefore, in most countries, for instance, quoting my home country of Italy, there is a clear institution which is called the Conference of States and Regions, where this dialogue is guaranteed. But it remains at the level of regions, not really at the level of municipalities. I think the European Union also made a big step up by reinforcing the role of the Committee of the Regions that not only sees regional representatives to make sure that the priorities of regions are well listened to, but also of cities. So basically, also mayors can be appointed to this European Assembly of Regions. In North Africa and the Middle East, things are a bit different. We notice there is much more cooperation, also because there is less political difference usually between governments of cities and regions and the main governments. So in this case, what we can see is that cooperation might exist, but of course, one of the advantages that we can see even when actors disagree is that dialogue happens and this confrontation leads to new ideas. So what I'm going back to the first point is that I'm not saying that one system is good and the other is bad. What I can only draw out are the main differences that we can identify. Now, when it comes to migration specifically, that's a very big issue, actually. Why is that? Because the main challenge for cities, and I can tell that across the whole region that I analyze, is that cities have very limited resources to dedicate to migration, integration, and social cohesion. Because most of these policies, actually, I have to correct myself, all policies are drafted at the national level with a national perspective. However, the realities of cities are very different from each other. If you think, for instance, of some major European cities, that really, they have such different realities that a national policy might touch, let's say, a sort of minimal common denominator of policy and understanding. But then the reality is so different that cities really need to step up and make sure they get enough resources from the national government. Therefore, that I would say is the main issue. And over the past few years, new professional profiles have arisen in the form of. I know sometimes it sounds like a bad word, but it really isn't. Is social lobbyists or social activists that exactly their job, their position is to make sure that the right stakeholders are addressed with information that they will care about. So in this case, let's say in most of Europe, you usually have between 2 and 3 ministries that legislate upon migration policies. Usually it's the Ministry for Interior, Foreign Affairs, and therefore social and labor policies, if a specific city makes the right choice, also in terms of communication, campaigning, and addressing and advocacy towards their right stakeholders, they can make sure that their concerns are addressed. I know this is not easy, it takes a lot of time, but I'm confident to say there has been a lot of improvement over the past 10 years. And in terms of communication, I can really see how campaigning and advocacy work has become a lot sharper than it was, I would say, before the big wave of social media, new wave of communication. I hope this helps addressing the point that we wanted to raise, but of course, I will be available to dig in a little further.
Oh, super. I think you've hit the nail on the head. And one of the last points there you made is the role of, the role of social media. And it's quite interesting, I think, for most of us, how we have valued communication, pre-pandemic, but also during the pandemic. And, some of us are sort of have also even become avid followers, for instance, of mayors and local authorities, or local authority officials that we sort of see having a much more positive outlook, if you want, even if sometimes that space is not allowed at the national level, or that there is a very different narrative at the national level. And of course, we're also seeing much more of these initiatives. I think, and we're really happy that you've shared with us a list of resources that, some of our students, but also some of the partners who are joining us here today. So we'll be posting some of the links as we are continuing on the conversation today. But a question that we'll give you that you can come back to later, as it's sort of, in my head and brewing, you've also talked about, and we talked about it yesterday when you and I were having a chat about today, and you talked about sort of migrants going to these few large cities, right? And how these cities remain still that kind of attraction. So we also know that in the space, in the fact that we don't have legal pathways for all migrants, undocumented migrants also find themselves in these cities. So we would like to also hear some of your thoughts and reflections on how cities can become much more open. And this is a tricky one, right? Without having sort of the legitimacy of even granting access, legal identity, or even being able to regularize migrants who are on their space, So how do these migrants sort of feel? How do they feel inclusion? How do they experience social cohesion? So we'd be interested to hear, maybe through your initiatives, how, undocumented migrants, irregular migrants are sort of catered for in terms of inclusion and social cohesion in the context of urban migration under your project. But, we're glad that you're here with us today, and we'll be sharing more of your resources in the chat. And as we move to a continent that's my motherland continent, Africa. Just calling upon Dr. Kennedy to come and share with us, and I would just read off his some aspects of his bio. I mean, he's the Director of Education and Training and Principal of the Ghana Labour College of Trades of the Trade Union Congress, and he's also an adjunct lecturer at the School for Development Studies in the University of Cape Coast. He's worked along extensive work under trade union work, whether it's research, advocacy on labor migration, governance. He's a labor activist and the founder of the International Trade Union Confederation, and particularly on the Africa Trade Unions Migration Network. And he has also served on the Ghana National Platform on Migration and Technical Working Group that looks at labor migration in Ghana. Extensive work around labor migration on the continent, and he's an economist and holds a PhD in migration studies, which was a collaboration between the University of Ghana and the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. So, a lot that comes with Dr. Kennedy, and we are happy, Kennedy, that you're here joining us today. And we just, wondered that, even as you will kick us off, situate us a bit, in understanding labor migration dynamics on the African continent. My younger experience, if I could say, in terms of experience, has, and also the knowledge that's out there, is that there's a lot of intra-regional migration. And often when we talk about migration on the African continent, the destination, I think, that has come to mind over the last years, even though this is being diffused, is that it's another place but Africa. But we also know that actually statistics have shown us that Africans are moving more on the continent than the numbers that we're seeing leaving the continent. So we wanted to understand from the African perspective, what is inclusion? Do we actually have, as somebody would say, an African definition of inclusion? What does social cohesion look like? Migrants moving from Cote d'Ivoire to Mali, migrants moving from Ghana, from Sierra Leone to the Gambia, migrants arriving in Mali from different parts, migrants transiting through Chad. What does integration look like for different migrants? So maybe you can situate us around that. Over to you, Kennedy.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's great to be part of this discourse. This is an important topic, particularly with regards to the work I'm doing. And if you look at the objectives, it's talking about empowering migrants and societies, and not just the migrants as we used to know, so that we can have proper inclusion and cohesion. Before I come to the dynamics within the African context, my take on inclusion has to do with integration. It may take various forms, but we're looking at support systems, mechanisms, and conditions that will be created for migrants to fully contribute their quota wherever they find themselves. You are also looking at how those mechanisms can strengthen the vulnerable and excluded in society. So that is my take on inclusion, or if you like, integration. It could be talking about economic, social, cultural, political, and various facets of inclusion, so that the excluded can be brought into the mainstream of various dimensions to fully contribute their quota. But in terms of cohesion, we are zeroing down to issues about unity, connecting very well with the society, and integration can contribute to cohesion. And migration is an influencer, because various cultures with various characteristics come into, there are difficulties to actually fuse very well. But you're talking about the capacity of society to ensure that the welfare of its members, and in this case, its members could be migrants or the citizens, are well catered for, reducing disparities and trying to avoid polarization and discrimination. This has to do with cohesion, so that the societies, that the members of that society can work very well like one unit in that aspect. If you look at the issue of migration, globally, currently we have about 280 plus million migrants across the globe. But if you look at this, less than 20% or even 10 are within Africa in terms of the migrant stock in Africa globally. So, but majority of these, the migrant stock within Africa, are Africans. So we always say that Africa is inter and intra migratory. Inter across regions like West Africa, the Central African region, the Middle, Southern Africa, or Northern Africa. Or intra, within West Africa, you have the members circulating within the various countries, like from Nigeria to Ghana, or from Ghana to the Ivory Coast, or you go to Eastern Africa, you have people migrating from Uganda to Kenya, or from Kenya to Ethiopia to seek for employment. So these are the dynamics of, so you see that over 80% of these are Africans moving around Africa. So that is to dispel the notion that majority of Africans are actually moving out to Europe or the Middle East or North America. That is not the case. And within the regional blocks I've indicated, you have the Western bloc and the Eastern bloc, East Africa and West Africa, being the dominant migratory sectors or regions, if you look at the statistics across time. So these are the the dynamics that you have within the African distinct. But let me also add that you are looking at various dimensions of migrants, low-skilled, largely irregular, you have refugees moving, and these are the kind of dimensions we need to consider when we are talking about responses in terms of inclusion and social cohesion, because these various dimensions have their challenges whilst moving to the host country. And that's what we need to consider when we're looking at issues and responses to inclusion or integration procedures and that of bring about social cohesion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for kind of, bringing that perspective to us, talking about the intra-regional and inter-regional dynamics that are there. And then what would you then say, when we look at then, migrants that are moving between the various spaces? I mean, I think that there's the regular migration that is there and facilitated by, protocols, free movement protocols that are across different regional economic communities. But we also know that somehow, Africa is wrapped into what, the famous spaghetti ball. I think for those who work around regional integration have seen that. For instance, I'm from Zambia, and Zambia is part of SADC, is also part of COMESA. And also, I think from others who are off the continent sort of see then what is the role, for instance, for the African Union, because there are also some different type of protocols that are coming from there. So trying to situate then, inclusion, and who, bringing it down then back to where it sits. And inclusion is then sitting with these local, our local authorities, our mayors, our councillors, and those who represent populations. But at the same time, we also know that in most African countries, the pen in terms of policy development and policy guidance is coming from the central level. Where do you sort of see that policy setting around inclusion when we think about the continental with the African Union, this intra-regional, inter-regional groups, and then coming down to the national level, but knowing that inclusion is taking place really at the local level?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that at the continental level, what the African Union has tried over time to do is to have a holistic policy that will guide the way and manner migrants governance is done across the regions, because all the regions have their dynamics. You are talking about the East African Commission, or the ECOWAS region, or North Africa, or the Middle, or the South. And therefore, you see that specific to migration, we have the AU migration policy, and then the Strategic Action Plan 2014 to 17. This is supposed to be the overarching document to guide what kind of policies are formulated at the regional blocks level. And of course, you have the East Africans, I guess they have a draft policy on labor migration or on migration. There's also the IGAD, which is that intergovernmental authority, also spearheading on one aspect, depending on the scope of membership. But of course, you also have the West African aspect of it. And all these policies are guided by the AU framework and the AU Commission strategic plan of action. And therefore, you expect that at the national level or at the regional blocks level, this will be reflected. But of course, over time, we are looking at how people are made to participate in these spaces. The policy-making space is very key. Just like you are talking about trade, are there spaces created for the vulnerable groups to earn their living? These are issues about inclusion. But at the policy level, what the AU has done over time is to make sure that the key stakeholders are brought on board in these discourses to shape the framework. So you see that over time, looking at the country level, you have the tripartite structures being part. We are talking of the trade unions, which have large representation. You are talking about the employers, organizations, and you're talking about government. These are the key stakeholders when it comes to policy about migration issues. And therefore, over time, these policies are framed at that level. For instance, in Ghana, there was the launch of the National Migration Platform. This is expected to have that political space for every actor to input and to discuss the issues confronting migration and what we can do. And this is expected to zero down to a local level and make sure that policies framed are reflected on the national policy. But over time, as you might have seen, there have been agitations for space. We have the case of Nigerians, traders or residents having agitations with Ghanaian traders in the informal economy, which has to do with the conflict between the policies. We have the ECOWAS protocol on free movement, residency, and investment, and other things, which conflicts with a national policies on who can have an activity in petty trading. So these are issues to do about policy. And at the level of that, how can the vulnerable groups be part of the process to make sure that these are reviewed to be in line with the continental policy at the national level? These are the challenges. There are agitations like the xenophobic attacks in South Africa some time back about spaces, about issues of employment, people thinking migrants in their destinations, being hosted in their countries, taking up their jobs, and other spaces of economic activity. These are the things that, in terms of the policy discourse and the policy framing, the vulnerable groups who are the migrants and the key actors are brought on board to make sure that the policy is framed to capture their needs and dynamics so that it will be able to fit in well with what the society perceives to be the case, so that there will be that positive balance between the society that is accepting the migrants and part of the migrants that must be able to be fully assimilated in that particular system. And these are the issues that we need to be looking at.
Kennedy, thank you very much for, really giving us a very clear picture, I think, from that continental level, the regional level, the role they play, and also, with some very practical examples of what we see as, it's almost like you've given us, the good in terms of the intentions that we have, and the bad and the ugly that we see out of xenophobia. And I'm glad that, you've also just touched on that, because I think this is one of those issues that always comes up when we talk about social cohesion. And maybe when we come back later, it would be interesting to hear from you when you think about, some of those stumbling blocks that we have, and particularly in relation to what the GCM puts as an ambition. So here I'm talking about also regular pathways. Often when we've talked about regular pathways, on the African continent, sometimes we are very quick to pick across the Mediterranean and say, hey, Europe, why don't we have, why don't we have enough, circular migration? Why are we not having more regular pathways? Could you do something beyond your talent partnerships? And we'll hear also a bit more, hopefully, from Marco on the work around talent partnerships. And we're talking about kind of circular migration, but actually on the African continent, people moving from Malawi, young men and women moving from Malawi going to work in the onion supply chain in South Africa have the same kind of concerns as, Sierra Leonean migrants moving to the Gambia, or vice versa. And the same would happen for Zimbabwean migrants trying to move into, my home country, Zambia, as well. That we actually are not, even though we have these regional things that are sitting above us like drones, we somehow don't, make them touch the lives of migrants on the ground. So it would be interesting to hear from you what you have to say about regular pathways and kind of, how do we move some of these issues forward as a starting point for social cohesion and inclusion related issues. But thank you for, sharing with us on these points today. And we look forward to hearing a bit more. We will cross over to the Americas, and this time we will be in Canada. And I know it's super early for Shamaka, who's here with us, joining us from Victoria in Canada. And Shamaka, the first time that I approached you, it was, through a LinkedIn on Twitter, and, thinking about the important work that, that you are doing in Canada. So just as I introduce you and give the question, Shamaka Dubo is a former refugee who fled civil war in Somalia and has spent around 20 years seeking a safe haven until Canada offered him a home in 2012. And before moving to Canada, he was a human rights advocate and worked with refugee organizations in North Africa. After casting his vote at the same time, he got elected as a for the Victoria City councillor. So he's a councillor in Victoria City in Canada, and he's committed to diversity, inclusion, building equitable inclusion and compassionate communities. I'm really triggered by this in your bio, Shamaka, in terms of the compassionate communities and his work around marginalized communities. And he has been recognized, with various awards, including the Victoria Community Leadership Award in 2017. Shamaka has a degree in business technology from the University of Cape Breton and has worked at the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria, as well as the Victoria Immigrant Refugee Services Center. So we're really talking about, somebody who has been a frontliner face-to-face with migrants, as well as having a very personal experience with his journey. And he has been a member of the executive committee of the Canadian Council for Refugees and has served, in various organizations as a volunteer. Shamaka, we could go on, and I'm happy that I will be sharing your bio with everyone else, and sharing some of your resources. But we're glad, most important, that you're here joining us today. And as the first Somali Canadian to be elected councillor in Victoria, I mean, I would like to ask you, as though it happened yesterday, to say, how did that feel in terms of inclusion? So, already from that personal experience and from the very difficult journey that you have had at the tender age of 8 to where you are today, what has inclusion really meant to you along your different paths, from the transit places you have been? We can even start all the way from, leaving Somalia, but also just understanding that transit journey, and then on to Canada and on to the role that you play right now in the local council in Victoria there, and also talking about, some of the work that you have seen around inclusion and some of the work that you are engaged in terms of promoting inclusion and social cohesion for migrants and refugees. Over to you, Shamaka.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me today. And I'm very glad to be able to join, but also listen and learn. Yes, thank you for the introduction. And before I begin, we usually do in Canada land acknowledgement, because to acknowledge that everyone else is immigrant except the indigenous people that belongs to the lands that we call home today. So I'm joining you the capital city of British Columbia, Victoria. And I really want to show my gratitude and respect and acknowledge the territory upon which I'm joining you virtually, the Lungquancanis people, whose traditional territory that I live, play, work, and build relationships. The Songhees, Squamish, and Wasanix people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day, including those who came here as settlers, immigrants in this generation or generation past, and those of us who came involuntarily because of a war or persecution, or particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And I make this acknowledgement not as some sort of historical footnote, but a commitment to true and lasting reconciliation with indigenous people. So as you see that, as I make that land acknowledgement, it's a reminder that Canada was always a home to immigrants and has a long history when we speak about immigration. And also, as you see on my Zoom screen background, virtual background, is a February in Canada is a Black History Month. And although I might be recently arrived person of African descent, but Black people have been here since 1600th century. So Black communities have a long history in Canada, although some of us might have arrived most recently. And Black Canadians do continue to contribute, both past and present, and really shaped the development of this country as any other immigrants continue to do so. And Black Canada is so diverse, and the reality of Black Nova Scotia, who are been here from long time since that came from the United States, and at the period of slavery would be different. The experience from Black from Caribbean or recently arrived immigrant from Ghana or from Ethiopia. So the reason why I share that is a little bit to celebrate and acknowledge the Black History Month. And coming back to your question, you're right. I am a person who've and other countries hosted me, and as either on a refugee camp or on an urban context. There were times that I was undocumented, and there was times that I was under the United Nations Higher Commission registered. So speaking of the movements and borders, I have personally experienced that. But coming to Canada, before I speak of the question, I just want to share most of my opinions and the way I carry myself is shaped by the experience. I come from a very humble upbringing, and gratitude to my mother, who stood up for a lot of injustices and was outspoken. So, and always speak in defense of those who had less, and also who she had so much care and compassion for everyone she met. And as a child, learning from my elders and from my mother. And that's when I dedicated all my life to work human rights advocate, fighting for communities, so that all members feel safe and are able to access care at all stages of their life, and so that people could be supported to reach their personal and professional pursuits. And that's why I ran for an office, because I loved the community that I live, and I wanted to be part of that, pushing to be more inclusive. I just want to talk a bit of the landscape of Canada, and because, and don't mind me if you already know, and perhaps some of the students that might have to understand a bit on the geographic context of it. And Canada, the only country we have border is, and we have the longest border with the United States of America. So we have the unique situation that it's not like Europe or a lot of African countries where people can come easily. So that itself sets Canada in a unique place. And there are different levels of government. So there's federal government, which deals with immigration, and there is provincial level and territorial government. Then there is a municipal government, which is the local government, which I'm part of. And the local government is the arm length of the provincial government. So it was interesting area to hear what role do local government has integrating and playing an active role when it comes to integration of newcomers or those who arrive to the cities. And there is also First Nation governance. That means indigenous communities have their own governance, and we have a parliamentary democracy, and it's a constitutional monarchy. And the reason why I share that is that to understand government of Canada, actually, in 2001 budget at the federal level, they spent 1.7 billion on immigrant settlement and integration services across Canada. So the government of Canada is a bit of a unique when it comes to immigrant receiving countries, because they invest a lot of money in integration, and whether it is employment, whether it's a language, whether it is orientation, so that immigrants be succeeded. And those services has eligibility, which I'm not going to go into it because is a lot of detail in terms of what services and who could access that. But when so for the settlement services, there are people looking for jobs, places to live, making friends, language, and community services, understanding the local cultures and customs. So usually when we say immigrant, we speaking about the last 5 years recently arrived immigrant, because everyone is immigrant, even if people came 100 years ago or generations past. But when we speak about immigrant, we usually speaking about folks that arrived recently 5 years. So there is that and one unique thing is that the immigration stream is usually economic or family reunification or humanitarian, which is the asylum and refugee. But the highest number is economic stream, and people that come as a permanent resident, which means it's a pathway to citizenship. Speaking of inclusion, but that's not the majority cases, because people can come at the airport or enter irregular other ways and seek asylum. And there's so many reasons come people to Canada, international students. So, and then people, their immigration status do change. And there are people who are also undocumented, and there are temporary foreign workers. So there is a lot of status, but the majority of them lead to citizenship. And that is why it's a bit unique when you compare to other countries. So why did I run for local government at the time in 2018? Because I believe local solutions, because local government is the closest government to the people. And that's where the solutions are. And that's where the people's daily lives, from the traffic, transit, the water, the school system. So the local governance is a very important, but the reality is, earlier someone alluded, is that although a lot of responsibilities offloaded to the local government, but there is the revenue and authority in terms of the jurisdiction is limited. And although everything happens at the city, but we don't have the power and to deal with a lot of things. At the end of the day, we are just the arm length of the provincial government. So when I was elected, I didn't only bring my work experience or my education, but I brought also my personal experiences and also the experiences of who I am. I'm a renter, so I don't own a house, I rent. I'm a transit rider, so I ride the public transit. I'm a person of African descent, I'm immigrant, I'm a Muslim. So all those identities and experiences shape the way I make policies and bring those discussions on the table. And that's why it's really important the policymakers and the public servants should reflect the communities they serve, so that the communities and the public will have a more trust with the government when they see themselves. So one of the initiatives directly answer to the topic we're talking about is that we worked something called Welcoming City, which I encourage you to look at. It is the Welcoming America model, where local governments look at the standards. So as much as I would love to go more in detail, but I will share at the chat, the bottom line of really trying to create that, and I'm the co-chair with the City of Victoria mayor, and what we did is that the city already had a landscape, as I earlier alluded, that there are settlement agencies. When we say settlement agencies, which I also worked before I ran, is those organizations who give services to immigrants, temporary foreign workers, refugees. And I don't like all these titles, but that's the reality that sometimes people use. But at the end of the day, is what services do people get? So what we did is that we invited all the leaders, the public library, the commerce of Chamber of Commerce, the indigenous nations, in the ethnocultural associations, the public schools, the senior centers, international students, the police, members at large, and formed a task force and said, let's come together and see what will work our city, so that we can create a plan that puts a roadmap for years to come toward becoming a strong, more inclusive community where everyone, including immigrants and refugees, are accepted, respected, and feeling that they belong. So we worked on a strategy, an action plan after engagement and long process with consultants. But what I really liked here is we didn't only focus on immigrants, but we worked with the public at large so that they will be buy-in, and which I will share. You'll be able to read the plan. But other things the city did is that we made public transit free, and anyone who's the age of 18 and younger, for everyone. So that means immigrants benefit from that. And when we came in, there is a program called Life Pass, is access recreational parks and other things for if people are low income. So what we made it is we made it 2 years and unlimited, and you just apply one. So one of the things I'm really focused on is how to remove barriers, so that regardless of your immigration status, so at least you could access city services. And when people interact with city services, they can walk away and feeling positive. It's a lot of work, and I really believe that cities has a role to play, although they don't have a lot of resources and their jurisdiction is limited, but local solutions are key tackling when it comes to national and global challenges. And I love one of the, Marco was speaking how cities learn from each other, because cities are not isolated. They can learn the best practices. And there's no one size fits all. What works for Victoria might not work for Berlin, might not work for Kampala. But how do they learn from each other and really see what works for the community? But to conclude it, 20% of Victoria population are newcomers and people who are new immigrants or refugees to Canada and have settled in Victoria according to the 2016 census. And yes, immigrants still face a significant social economic barrier to integration into the community and Canadian society. And that's why the federal government was investing $1.6 billion. But I hope that cities also play active role so that in the long term integration to include all the services so that people feel not only they belong, but how do you create neighborly interaction so that when at the national level, when politics go a little bit off track, so that people would know each other, and then that wouldn't influence what's happening on the ground. So thank you.
Shamake, thank you very much for walking us through not just your own personal journey, but how that has really, like you have shaped and impacted how you're working as a councillor in the city of Victoria in Canada. And I think the long-termism is something that indeed many cities could learn from. Often, you know, in the space of migration governance, when we think about Canada, it seems to be this golden standard. And I think some of what you have unpacked shows that there is a lot of work in becoming part of a golden standard. Yes, we understand that there may be a lot of different challenges that come, and we have also heard before from other speakers from similar spaces. In fact, I think we'll have a speaker next week talking about discrimination and what that looks like for migrants. So I'm sure, you know, these are also some of the issues that we could also have a deep dive with you a little later on. But maybe as a question that would come later, as we'll soon open the floor to hear from our audience. I think it would be interesting. You've told us a lot about some of the allies that you have in terms of, you know, public agencies, in terms of providing basic services and making that city really be that welcoming city, you know, working together with, you know, senior level within the city of Victoria as well at the level of the mayor, and sort of this kind of intergovernmental services that are there. And what we wanted to throw back at you as a challenge is to sort of say, when you think about what you see in other spaces, and I would take you to Somalia because it's a place that's familiar to you, or any other spaces that you have passed through in transit, you know, where do you sort of see how these could be transposed? And it's a bit of a trick question, but in trying to think about the influences that we have, because I think we are still stuck even after COVID in trying to learn from others. I think we're happy to see the lessons, but we don't want to trap them. So it would be interesting to hear from you kind of cooperation that you have also a little bit outside and how that has looked like. Ngozi, your hand is up and I'm glad you're already up to the task. So I will ask you to go ahead and ask your question to the panelists. Ngozi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Greetings all. Dr. Kennedy, it's very interesting how you unpack the spatial aspect of integration, and especially reminiscing the struggle in space we had in Nigeria back in the days known as Ghana Must Go. We have many Ghanaians we are asked or forced by the government to leave the country, you know, and also with the current issue Nigerian traders are having in Ghana now because of policies that is not palatable to the traders. And yeah, Mr. Marco, in the work you do, please, do you also put in consideration the politics of skills involved in the inclusion? For example, in Africa, we have more of the inclusion here is more of people are different. They are different, but still they are embedded in the society. I mean, the migrants, they are still different, but embedded. While in Europe, they are more of, migrants are expected to assimilate into the European expected to be assimilated into the European society. Unlike here in Africa, they can be different but still embedded in the society. So in the work you do you also put this in consideration? And Mr. Dr. Kennedy, have you also noticed that towards the border, when migrants they have the space, the border space is only at the border, but if you get inland, you see that migrants they don't really have problem. Like in Nigeria, when the migrants are living at the border space, they always have problem with immigration services. They got disturbed, but when they go inland, they don't have problems. In Europe, the border space is everywhere, or in the United States, it's everywhere. Migrants are being asked about their documentation and all that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ngozi, for that. Ladies and gentlemen, we will ask that you raise your hands. Otherwise, we'll also go and check what we have in the chat. Mr. Basi, did you want to share some reflections with us?
Yeah, I really want to. My take will be on Africa as a whole. In my experience, I salute Dr. Kennedy. I believe it that policymakers' policy formulation sometimes doesn't touch the grassroots, which is the main reason why the conflict at the upper level is going on, where you have men that sit in and formulate policies that may not necessarily know what is on ground. They don't know exactly what is on ground, but maybe they come from left hand, from right hand, sit into one space, and then they formulate policies, not minding the grassroots. So I thank Kennedy for putting that look, that is the main problem. And I want to believe that is the main problem. I happened to went to Cameroon, and I see some Nigerians, they were sitting in one space. I asked them what really happened. They say, oh, they have sent people to guide us because Nigeria is about playing football, and there is that tendency. If there is anything that happened, we are going to run helter-skelter. You know, things like that are not supposed to be, in my own text. Things like that are not supposed to be. But like I always said from the word go, orientation matters. Orientation matters because sometimes the guy who is calling the authority, who is calling the shot, doesn't know much about the grassroots. He doesn't know much about migration, doesn't know much about what is happening within the community, but he called the shot because he has the key to power. So I want a situation whereby we can do our best to bring the upper class, the lower class, the middle class, bleach together, pick up men from communities before policies such as that will affect the free movement of people in Africa will be put in place. That is my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Basi, for that contribution. Dr. Raj, did you want to come in?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I think you put together, and let me congratulate Paddy first before I come to the panelists, for putting together this different set of regional experiences, and I think this is great. You've got European on one side, you have the African and the North American or Canadian for that matter. And thank you so much to all the panelists. I think your contribution seems to be quite unique for me because you have brought in your personal experience and you have brought in your insight into this issue of integration and cohesion. What I want to reflect on is the status of the migrant determines very much as to access to these various services or social cohesion or integration. In the case of Canada, it seems quite neat because most people, the majority of the people come through this, as you mentioned, Mr. Sharmakar, they come through this pathway, legal pathway. So there's need for labor. So you apply and they put in this point system. And if you qualify, you come, okay? Others, yes, they have temporary things. So you come and you have to go. And there is quite a bit of vigilance on that. And then there's the refugees. They're quite in humanitarian visas. I think they're quite generous. At the moment, I think 20% of Canada's population is, well, migrant in the sense that people born outside Canada. So that's quite large, 20 or 21%. So which shows that there is reception, not welcome, reception, receptivity towards, because they need labor, okay? So there's some kind of order. There's some kind of order in the house. It's not helter-skelter, you crossing the border like in the US. And of course, if we go, I'm not here going to sing praises for Canada, but there seems to be order. So the lesson we get is that once there is regular, orderly and regular, I'm sorry to use the word orderly or disorderly for that matter, then there will be, so because there's a plan. Now, when there is no plan and yet there's need for undocumented workers, that's the sad part. So that means you need the undocumented, but you're unwilling to open up pathways. So here is a dichotomy. So the Canadian case is, yes, you come regularly and every now and then there will be some kind of irregular, but very little, okay? So if they don't open up regular pathways and they have need for labor, then people are going to find ways to come in. So this is where the confusion is. As regards the continent, I think this is a very interesting, interesting in the sense that you have free movement and yet you have made no plan for that free movement. And once it's free movement, you're on your own. So you look for something, whatever you can find. And you set up those tents across the road because there's no provision for you, because there's no need for you in the legal sense, and yet there is need. So you have Zimbabweans in South Africa and driving towards the airport in Cape Town, there's this 2-3 mile long camp city. And of course, they become, they're harassed by locals, depending on the local situation. So what I want to flag now is, after saying that there is need for, I'm not saying regular, but there is need for some kind of pathways whereby people can come, because there is need for people, there's need for labor. So you have got a situation where there's need for labor, but governments are unwilling to open up space for them. So they find a way to come in. And especially in the case of free movements, like we have in the Caribbean, we have the CARICOM region where people can, from one island to the other, can go. And yet when Haiti was admitted into the CARICOM, a lot of Haitians started to come to these various islands, and then there was this xenophobia set in. Now, after a while, they withdrew. Haiti is no longer a member of CARICOM. Maybe that was one of the reasons. Okay, so you've got free movement, and yet there are no mechanisms how to deal with them. People are left to their own devices. So how would there be social cohesion if there's no plan? How can you have a plan with the, so the lesson to learn from the EU would be, where there's free mobility within the EU for EU citizens, how there's no reason for social cohesion, right? Is there any reason? Because the kind of people who are going to move are well off. They're not going to leave their well-off country to go to another country, which is not better off than the one they left behind. So there's already cohesion. There's already integration in the case of the EU. Citizens of the EU, but there's no integration and cohesion where people from the South are going, whether within South or to outside the South. So if you are facing structural issues, which means most of the people in the global South face structural problems already, lack of employment, lack of opportunities, lack of social services, lack of that. Now, at that situation, do we expect then that there would be integration? Okay, so that's the thing I flag to anyone who wants to pick up. Thank you.
Dr. Raj, thank you as usual for shedding light also on the Caribbean experience. They're a region that you are very well knowledgeable about. Just for our panelists to know that Dr. Raj is one of the vice presidents of GRFDT and a pillar behind this program as well. And I think some of the issues that you have raised indeed touch on kind of these actions, that are sitting within the Global Compact, objective itself, when it's being unpacked, talking about where we can also teach social cohesion. Do we also start in the school environment, for instance? What's the space for multiculturalism, which I think we have also heard in other webinars before. It was as though Brexit, for instance, one of the examples showed that the problem was not the fact that it was migrants. The problem was probably that we were not really ready, or Brexit, or that particular community was not ready for a much more multicultural environment that we have seen, because now migrants are coming back in different mechanisms and waves and strength. Anyway, a debate for another day. Let me just call upon Sarah Koshin, who has been with us here on one of the webinars, and she's a gender and diaspora specialist that has of Somali and Dutch origin. So Shamaka, when I told Sarah that we were having you here on the panel, she said, "Oh, can I just say something very quickly?" And of course, as soon as I saw her, I decided to put her on the spot. So Sarah, here's me putting you on the spot to share your reflections, and then after we'll have our panelists give their reactions to the questions and the reflections, and we will close with Professor Benoit. Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Patty. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for letting me speak. Thank you so much for inviting me to this very important conversation. And also, thank you very much for organizing this, this webinar, this certificate course, very important. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's evening here in Somalia. Actually, I'm in Mogadishu, Somalia, and I am one of the previous speakers in this course, and I will be speaking also on the 17th, I believe, about diaspora advocacy and diaspora resource mobilization. That will be on the 17th. I look forward to that. I look forward to having some of you in that course as well. Having said that, I would like to also greet the panel speakers for today. And it was very interesting to listen to you all speak about your personal and professional experiences, as people from on the ground. I don't really have much to say other than that. I wanted to ask Mr. Dubo, particularly, I was struck by some of the initiatives that you as a leader, together with your team, are organizing in Canada to make to make life a bit easier for migrants living there. You mentioned some initiatives that you're actually undertaking for not only migrants but for everybody. For example, the one you mentioned about for young people, particularly under 18, I think it was. I was just wondering, it's getting very tough. The world in the world right now, things are getting very tough for migrants, and even though there are many initiatives that are being undertaken to promote inclusion, to discourage discrimination and racism, but the reality is that the things are getting very, very tough for migration, for migrant youth, and I think you can still hear me, right? I'm hearing some background noise.
Yes, we can hear you. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, to what extent these initiatives are actually bringing about concrete, difference in people's lives. Are things getting easier for migrant people living in your respective communities? Are there any studies that have been undertaken to show that some of these initiatives are indeed leading up to change, to transformation, to more understanding and more tolerance, more peaceful coexistence? And then lastly, have there been any studies that you may have undertaken to see what are some of the gender differences? Are men and women benefiting equally, from these, initiatives that that you are undertaking to promote more understanding for migrant people living in your communities, especially far away from from home, in the diaspora, for example. I'm interested in this because we are often on the lookout for best practices, there's so much going on, but then, you know, how much change are we really achieving? What policies are very effective more than others? What programs can we duplicate in various situations that have, you know, led to some kind of harmonious coexistence between people, promoting understanding, promoting respect for women, respect for migrants, youth, migrant people, let me say, generally speaking. I'm interested in this myself because I am always, you know, doing research, and as a researcher, you really want to know what is really, you know, standing out from the rest. So thank you very much. You know, it's opportunities like this where we are able to ask questions like this about what is really working and what not and why. So thank you for giving me the opportunity, Paddy. I look forward to seeing you on the 17th.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing in this webinar. And now we just take a moment, in the interest of time, we take a tour de table. Maybe we start with Marco. We can hear some of your reflections. Then we move to Dr. Kennedy and then Sharmaka, and we'll have some closing remarks. Marco, over to you.
Would you like me to respond to the many questions, or would you like me to address the issue you mentioned earlier about undocumented
You can do a
migrants?
combination of both. I know it's putting you on the spot. You can do a combination of
it's fine.
both. Yes.
I think that the biggest contribution from the students was from Madame Raj Bardoui, who mentioned the value of the European Union, a continent that from the ashes of the worst war ever, continent of refugees, built the most advanced institutional framework in history, where free migration is guaranteed to today 440 million people. So I think I think that today in a lot of the international forum migration, we forget that, but that is the example. That is the example to follow, to create an area with free movement of people, goods, and services that then creates integration. Today, we think of Europe as one thing. It's really not. It's a combination of countries, cities, and regions. But because of the great minds of our founding fathers after the war, we managed to create full integration where inclusion is no longer an issue. That is a comment I wanted to address. And then I will conclude with a specific comment about undocumented migrants, because it is definitely the toughest challenge. And I'll give you clear recommendations from FCUCM, because basically what we notice is that undocumented migrants with irregular status receive little to no mainstream social support and may be subject to removal should they seek to access it. So another issue that is raised by local governments that concerns is the administrative burdens. And I'm sure that many of the stories we heard today are testimonials of that, faced by undocumented migrants to access basic services. I'll give you some good examples from the Mediterranean, not only from Europe, but also from Africa and the Middle East. Is that, for instance, the government of SPACs in Tunisia have taken a strong stand in favor of securing universal access to local hospitals by negotiating with the government, especially for undocumented migrants. So I'm talking about the city in Tunisia that took these steps and this work during COVID-19, where a lot of discrimination was performed to migrants as virus carriers. So a city in Tunisia managed to do that. I'm sure it can be an example for many other in Europe, also in Grenoble, a city that is very advanced when it comes to inclusion, is making large efforts to overcome barrier to access by working on the concept of local ID cards, but also carrying out advocacy efforts in favor of universal access at national level. So basically they're working to get local ID cards so that you have at least one sort of identification that can help you legitimize your position at the national level. That's very brave, I have to admit. And of course, it's not going to be easy on the legal terms. And to conclude, in close coordination with the national level, cities like Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, Gaziantep in Turkey, or Douala in Cameroon, are trying now to implement inclusive sanitary responses comprising disinfection and protection measures during COVID-19 and beyond. I'm not talking about highly developed European or American or Canadian cities. I'm talking about cities that face many challenges, but they understand the value of making sure that undocumented migrants get at least basic protections, and they do that at the local level. I think my only recommendation today for your great work and for the work of all that are listening to this is to learn from other examples. There is a pool of knowledge that is available to everybody. And I think the value of this forum and the value of the lectures that you provide is that migration stakeholders and migration entrepreneurships and migration analysts look at other examples that they can implement in their own cities. I learned a lot today from Sharmaki's and Kennedy's testimonials. And of course, I will bring this experience to the next forum where I'll have to speak or present ICMPD or present the European perspective on migration. So I will conclude at that, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Marco. And I took the liberty to also share the resource that you shared on the specific question that Sarah asked around, she coined a question around the role of gender and some of the projects there. So I've just shared one of the resources that you've shared with us, but we have a whole compendium of resources from Marco as well that we'll be sharing in the Google Classroom. Shall we hear from Kennedy?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that to quickly respond to Ngozi's comment, I think it has to do with border issues with regards to the custom procedures, which makes it difficult for people to be flexible and easily move across the borders. But as he indicated, when people come in, you see less of that, those challenges that they face. And I think with regards to the specific policy, I think it's about the policy issues, and I always make this case that policies are not always concretized to address the realities on the ground. They exist in paper, but we don't see actions. For instance, this is just a policy issue for the political leaders and the key actors to sit down and make sure that it is reviewed to be in line with the ECOWAS protocol, and then people can go on with their economic activities and their living. This should look simple. But just to conclude, I think that migrants are now or increasingly becoming an important proportion of national populations. And we need to look at how effectively they can be included in the societies to bring about cohesion. I would always not want to begin with economic integration of migrants. But one, the key factors, one is cultural diversity. We need to have a kind of cultural sensitivity training to orientate the citizens to understand the social values, the dynamics of cultures, so that people can accept each other to be able to live. We also need to look at issues of social protection. These are issues that bring about social cohesion. And if you look at the trade union in Ghana, we are much into the informal economy to organize operators there who are largely migrants, to give them voice, to give them representation, so that their issues can be addressed at the highest level. And there's currently what we call People Pension Trust for informal economy workers to contribute towards their retirement. This is something that you can bring about social cohesion in the Ghanaian economy. I think there are also issues we have taken on board with the local assemblies, the major metropolitan assemblies, to make sure that spaces are created for the informal operators to engage their economic activities, where migrants are involved. And I understand the fact that cities are areas of contestation. The city size is reducing, and that is where the focus should be. Look at how cities can be arranged so that it creates enough space and brings about inclusion for those who are excluded. I also want to say that if you are looking about social cohesion, you have to also look at the issue of return migration. And if you look at Objective 19, it talks about those things. And the fact that whether you are outside your country or coming back, migrants should be made to be part of social dialogue. And this is the way they can be involved in the policy making at various levels so that they can bring to bear their concerns that needs to be addressed. And lastly, the issue of gender must be critically looked at, because we know that women in particular are very receptive to visitors. And therefore, if the issues of gender is carefully addressed in the way migration is governed, then we are halfway towards building social cohesion. I think that these are some of the few things that we need to be looking at. And also, can we begin to look at what are the indicators of social cohesion? I think that we need to have an idea and understanding collectively that these are the indicators of social cohesion or integration, and then we can move from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for that, Dr. Kennedy, for that. Shamaka.
Thank you very much. This has been very refreshing for me, and thanks to Sarah for the excellent question. If I speak about the gender question, when it comes to specifically to Canada, the context would be a bit different than the global South. And even when you look at the federal government, and they consider themselves feminist government in terms of and to make a feminist budget to address women's post-pandemic challenges. So there is a lot in terms of that aspect of it. But I think when it comes to gender, and this is my personal opinion, is that there is a lot has been achieved in Canada, but and where Canada comes short is that when it comes to race. Even if you look at positions in terms of public sector or the private sector, the employment, you would see women have reached, there's a lot of work to do, but has improved. But when it comes to racial equity, then there is still that gap compared to gender. So when you speak, it would be bit different than the global South, but the federal government is really focusing on the feminist budget. But I think coming to your question, is collecting data and data of gender, race, social demographic data is really essential component of the work eliminating any inequities. And if we don't know which population are potentially being impacted in a greater rate or ravaging certain population more than others, then how do we supposed to know where we direct resources or help public and policy decision makers to make informed decisions? So one of the biggest challenges now, and in British Columbia, the province that I'm in, and across the country, is there's a lot of discussion now on disaggregated data. So because when data is not disaggregated, it really conceals disadvantages and gaps that a particular group of people face in public service or in health, education, employment. So even when you speak about gender, then when you have disaggregated data, then you could see not only gender, but on a race-based as well, which is also crucial. In terms of the work at the City of Victoria, and we established for the first time when this council came, and I really championed so hard an Office of Equity, Inclusion, Diversity, and to be staffed, put the resources, because when you get elected, you have all these ideas and visions, but if you don't understand the capacity of your organization, then it's very hard for you to move or implement any policy. You might have the most attractive policies, but if you don't have the capacity and the resource, then it will be hard to implement. So we've established an office, and hopefully the work is beginning now to have an equity framework. And the hope is that it moves the government working from a silo and see a human being holistic, and see the root causes and the characteristics of social issues, and really identify where are the systematic barriers facing community and what are the pandemic effects on our residents. So the Office of the Inclusion and Diversity will work internal change, but also community relationships. But when you look at the Welcome City, is co-created and co-developed with the partners at the community that knows what this work is and have lived experience. And I'm hoping that the implementation part we will implement with the community. But the Equity Office also will look at external impact. And why this is important is that the city staff to look at the impacts of city policies, how do representative city are and building relationships with folks who are less connected to the city hall. And I want government to be transparent and open. And that's what I was pushing for the last 3 years, and really try to institutionalize the EDI office so that it really speaks to create and sustain equitable. And we haven't done any research to really look at the city because this work just begin. And when you elected different experiences of walks of life, then policies change. So we are just beginning this journey, which is a long journey before me. And I'm proud that I was a part of putting the bricks, and those who come after me would continue. And to conclude, the whole concept is how do we remove barriers to city services, and how do city services come inclusive so that people could really access. And speaking on the question on assimilation, in Canada, we have a multicultural act, so which is a bit different when you compare to some other countries. But also we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, which gives people more rights in terms of movements and practice of your religion and beliefs. Now there is a province, now there is a Bill 21, which I'm not going to go into it. But when you talk about the federal level, we have the Charter I have a copy of that in my house, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, because that is what guarantees our rights as Canadian and freedom, including those who doesn't have immigration status. So I'll leave it there. And this has been very interesting and I really enjoy it. It kind of like refreshed me. And it's a good way to start my morning. It's 7 a.m. here right now.
That's super. Very nice to hear, Shamaka. Thank you so much. I know, Kennedy, there's a burning hand there. I'll give you a minute before we ask Professor Benoit to give us some reflections and we close.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I wanted to make this point that the African Trade Union Migration Network is also in the picture. The plan of action we have from 2022 to 24 is aligned to the 23 objectives of the compact, and particularly one of the key issues there would be advocacy and campaign to create awareness and build that kind of collectivism. We are also building partnership with our Asian counterparts to learn from their experiences and what they are doing, and together as sending regions, we'll be able to look at how we can make sure that there's inclusion, particularly for our migrants in the Gulf states. And the coming months, we'll see a high-powered trade union delegation to Qatar to deliberate on various issues, particularly the kafala system, which restricts people from moving and from access to basic services when they get there to work. And that we are hoping can bring about cohesion in those regions. Thank you.
Kennedy, thank you very much for sharing that reflection. In actual fact, we had tried to see if we could have gotten colleagues for you to engage with, particularly on the kafala system, and we wanted to understand what that shapes inclusion and social cohesion in the Middle East, because we do know that it is an issue that has been burning for a very long time, and it's really good to hear that there's this kind of continental a movement from your side, from the network, in terms of engaging with other partners on it. So we'll be looking forward to that. Please share it with us so that we can share it with other our participants here. Professor Binod, may I give you the space to share with us? Professor Binod is the president of GRFDT, and he will share with us his reflections, and we will be closing after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paddy. Thank you very much, and thanks to all the speakers. I'm looking at the clock, and I know that its time is running out, but this is a great panel today that I have had. And in terms of, I'm not going to name the people because it takes time. And I heard about 7, 8, 9 speakers speaking, and all of them were so richly endowed with information, with analysis, with critical insights, that it makes me think how to look at them. And one way of doing it I find inspiring is to wear my hat of a teacher, of coming back to the classroom. How do I bring all this information, all the speakers that have spoken about and talked about, bring it back to the classroom? And that's where I think one way of doing it is to look at the objective itself, the objective 16. There is a lot to deconstruct this objective. And if I tend to think in terms of what are the phrases that are involved in this, it talks about empowering migrants and societies. To what extent? To the full. To the full. It is not talking about just empowering. It is putting an adjective there, and for full inclusion and cohesion. So I find 3 particular stakeholders in this. One at the micro level, the migrant and migrants, and the meso level is the society. And then who does it? That's the state, the member states, because it's the UN GCM objective. It is the macro level, the state's responsibility to implement what needs to be done for making a cohesion and inclusion full, to the extent full. And that's where I think what I derive the lessons that from these speakers who have shared their thoughts is that there is a slip between the lip and the cup. That I think is important, and how to bridge that gap. And that's where it takes me to the very well-known, globally well-known concept of the capability approach. The capability approach, but given by none other than Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate from my own country. He was a student of my own teacher, and I take pride in saying that he was the student. He was the first student of my teacher, and I was the last student of that teacher, Tapas Majumdar. So that's where the capability approach tells us how to look at these issues. And because this is a certificate course, and this is where the participants, whom we call students, some of them are highly accomplished themselves and are speakers and will be speaking in other sessions. But I take pride in calling myself a student for life. And that's where I think we need to gather all these good examples, or the macro had shared good examples from the global south. We always talk about the bad examples, but we also need to take into account what the countries are doing, what is there to be learned from. All these put together in a basket and try to see from the theoretical perspective, because we have to look at policies, practices, and then theory, because normally it flows from theory to policy and then to practice. But maybe we can look at an alternative way of interlinking the three aspects of the challenges which are underlying the 23 objectives of the GCM. I think we can go on talking, interacting on these issues back into the classroom, but because of the time, I would just leave you with these reflections. Thank you very much.
Professor Vinod, thank you very much for those prompt and very fitting remarks for this session. And thank you once again to our panelists for having joined us, from those that are starting their day super early in the morning to those that are almost ending their day in Europe and even going to bed for those who are in Asia Pacific. Thank you so much for finding time. To all the participants, students who join us every Tuesday and Thursday. We are going to have a session on Thursday, that's GCM objective number 17, where we look at eliminating discrimination. And I feel like the same panel would have been able to deliberate on a lot of those different issues. So we look forward to you joining us. For that particular session, we have really touched on a lot of different issues today that have shown us what the interconnection is between various parts of the Global Compact for Migration, but it also has shown us the fact that there's still a lot of work that we need to do, and the work starts even from, those of us who are migrants, those who are in the diaspora, and also in the different workspaces and responsibilities that we have placed upon us in society. And I think an interesting word that came from Shamaka there, talking about the compassion, I think that we add into this work interesting aspects that are related to education and understanding that social cohesion really begins by also opening the space for our cultures. What does it mean to live in a multicultural environment, and what does it mean to have a respect for other cultures? And I think a lot of different examples that have also come from Marco that have shown us that despite what the national policy may say or may allow or may even give space for, we still have there is still space that cities, there is still space that societies can contribute to in terms of allowing migrants to have full inclusion and social cohesion. And from us here at GRFDT, we want to thank everyone, especially also all the organizers in the background with the various support that you have provided. Thanks again. Thank you, Shamaka. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Good evening, and good.
Thanks and goodbye.